for what's actually our second Irish Studies Seminar of this semester. It's a tremendous pleasure for me to welcome back to Queen's Michelle McGoff-McCann, who completed her PhD. Here, survived being supervised by me for a number of years. She completed her PhD in history here in 2019. And is currently researching, writing and speaking on the history of County Monaghan in the 19th century, carrying out a number of really fascinating and important projects, including one relating to the Bath estate. But she's also just in the last couple of months published her first monograph. So you have published books before.
That's okay.
Yes.
First academic.
First academic monograph, that's right. Yeah. And the book is called The Irish Coroner, Death, Murder and Politics in County Monaghan, 1846 to 78, which is a wonderful publication and comes directly out of the PhD thesis, published by Four Courts Press in Dublin and available at an affordable price. This is a historical and social analysis of the coroner in pre-famine, famine and post-famine Ireland that exposes a significant gap in the administrative history. It focuses on William Charles Waddell, who was coroner of North County Monaghan for over 3 decades, and utilizes his detailed inquest reports to chart the evolving role of the coroner in this crucial period of Irish history. And it's on an aspect of this research that Michelle is going to speak to us this afternoon. The title of her paper is Death Investigation During the Great Irish Famine, the Role of the Coroner and the Inquest. So, Michelle.
Thank you. I just want to say I was very, very lucky. I'm definitely saying this, to have such a wonderful advisor, and I definitively could not have done the book or the research without Peter. So I just want to thank you again, and thank you for having me here. So, death investigation during the Great Irish Famine. I think maybe the way to start with this is the importance of the coroner, and that this is an area that's very under-researched. When compared with other figures of authority in local history, in local government in Irish history. And coroners worked within a political framework of gentrified officialdom. And it was still monopolized by a local elite, but yet most of these men were members of that local elite. And so what you see is the investigations that hopefully we get out of today is the investigations that the coroners do and that they perform can often put them at risk with not just their constituency, but with their peers in the local elite, because what they uncover is going to, I'll give you a heads up, is going to reveal local mismanagement often and inadequate government policies. So we're good. So the body of evidence, I kind of put this slide up here because you think of the coroners and it sounds all very, modern in the sense of what death investigation was, but it was very different in the 19th century. The coroners, what did they do? So their role was to investigate sudden, suspicious, or violent death, and ultimately to find someone responsible. So when there were verdicts of, for example, the visitation of God, or essentially someone just had a heart attack or they died of natural causes, even though there's some circumstances around it that would have provoked him and made him realize that he needed to investigate that, the grand jury, who has to pay for the coroner and has to pay for these investigations, well, they don't like that so much because that costs money. And unless it's really imposing, they're not so concerned with social good. They're more concerned with keeping a certain status, a certain level of justice, and finding anyone who's being disruptive in society and particularly violent. So I think maybe when we think about, before I go, of what that body of evidence is that we have mass famine graves of unidentified people that very rarely are dug up for DNA purposes. You also have in the tome of William Charles Waddell's case books, which I'll talk about in just a second, you do have 2 men that do what you would consider now forensic, a form of forensic analysis, which was really tissue samples. There's a guy named Andrews and another guy named Hodges, who are both actually working at Queen's University. And so their foundation was here. So that's where those samples would be sent. And it was primarily for poisoning cases. So what we can't do is kind of apply that modern sensibility to the 19th century Irish coroner. They're using as modern a techniques as is available to them at that time. So what do we have? So we have, as I said, we have mass graves for the famine. We have parliamentary papers. We have oral history. We have some letters that were sent around, and we have travel writers. But what's been underreported, and there's a good reason why, we haven't seen much about coroner's inquests. They're in the newspaper, but we're going to talk a bit more about why they're helpful, but maybe they can be a little bit biased in terms of how many are there at that volume, and is that reflective of how many people died in a particular region. So these are the case books, which I'm very proud to show you. I think the person who gave me the best word ever of how this came along, I'll say there was a bit of determination, but it was Professor Marie Coleman who said it was serendipity, and I couldn't agree more. I think it took an awful lot I found the second case book first. And that was what I wrote a book on a long time ago called Melancholy Madness. And I don't know what I was doing. I grouped all the deaths, and it was this was infanticide, and these were murders, and these were different diseases. And just to kind of explain what life was like and how people were dying at the time. And that was this case book here. But this case book here is the famine case book from 1846 to 1855. And it had been in existence. I'd heard about it. It was like mythical, it had been around. And then I found out it resurfaced, and the timing was perfect. So I found out it resurfaced, and I think it was about 2013, 2014. I went, right, I finally have enough, I think, to do a PhD on this, because the famine alone is going to just give me a volume of incredible information. But combined with the second case book, I've really got something here. And what didn't I have is this little thing right here, which is the third case book that was mislabeled at the Clones Library. I understand why. It was when William Charles Waddell dies in May of 1878. He's still got some loose ends in terms of his paperwork. Somebody else scooped it up and put that in, and over the years, it just looked like it was somebody else's, but it's very definitively his. This number ends in, not to be this person, but 1168, and then this one starts at 1169 because he kept the chronology of his inquests over time. So he conducts 1,223 inquests over his entire career of 31 years, and about 200 inquiries, he started to investigate a death and then went, there's not actually enough here. I don't really think I'm going to conduct a full inquest. So this is the foundation for all this work. And what we'll do is talk a bit now about who are these guys? What's the reputation of the coroner? Are they important? I mean, it's been underrepresented in Irish history for different reasons, probably because that is the only unique set of records of its kind, William Waddell's case books. Those three are the only of its kind that have all that level of detail. So it's extremely rare. So if that's that rare and we've only just found it now, we don't really know that much about the coroner and where they were placed in Irish history. So who are these guys, and what are they all about? So the reputation of the coroner in pre-famine Ireland isn't good. It's negative. They are paid per inquest. So it's kind of not their fault in this sense. They're paid per inquest. So there's a reputation of like, somebody died, I'll be right there. I'm going to make my money. And so even like you can tell the cartoon is the juror says the man's actually still alive. And the coroner says, well, the doctor declared him dead, so I'm carrying out the inquest anyway. So this would have been common knowledge and common humor at the time. These guys want their money. And they're seen to be profiting from death. And so just to give you an idea of the demographic of these guys. So let's see, at any given time, there's about 100 coroners in Ireland. And so radical MP Joseph Hume in 1826, he is working with Thomas Wise from the Catholic Association, and they say, right, we're going to do the demographics on jobs, civil servant jobs, for example. How many Catholics are in these roles? 0, 2. How many postmen are there? How many work here? How many clerks? But he includes coroners, Joseph Hume. And what's interesting is that there's 108 coroners at this time, and 29 of them are Catholic. And this is like far outweighs any other position that they have recorded in their research. And it's about a 26.7% of coroners are Catholic. This 26.7% eclipses any other position. So what's happening here? What's going on? And you start to understand a little bit about it. So, for example, so Neve Howland's research and Theo Hoppen's research shows that jury intimidation was really rife in inquests and in criminal trials. So, and particularly of Catholic witnesses. And you also have in 1833, the Prime Minister, Earl Grey, he gives a speech at the House of Commons and says, I mean, there are Catholics that are terrified to testify. You know, what are we going to do about it? He gives an example of a man whose father-in-law was murdered, and an inquest is going to be held. And he says, I'd rather suffer the consequences of the legal system than participate because I'd be in danger for my life. So the representation of Catholics as coroners is because prior to the 40 shilling freeholders losing their ability to vote in 1829, they get to vote for who they want. This is the only elected position in local government prior to, which we're going to get to, 1838, when the Poor Law happens. This is the only, before then, this is the only elected position in local government. So this is dangerous. Who are these guys? Well, really, they're guys who they want to climb up the social ladder. You know, you're not going to see like Lord Bath's a coroner. I mean, it's not going to happen, or somebody on the grand jury. They're far too important. These are usually a group of men, and it fits, that are also land agents. They might have a legal or medical background, but they don't have to. That's not what's required. And we're going to talk about what the actual requirements were for this job in just a second. So just throwing up Thomas Wakley. Thomas Wakley, another radical MP, and he's an English surgeon and he's a coroner. And what he's doing is trying to combat in England nepotism and privilege and basically incompetence in these roles, not just for coroner, but in lots of roles. But he's a coroner himself, and he can see where it's not doing anybody any good, that this isn't a professional role. What kind of qualifications do you need, right? So if it says nepotism and privilege, it gives you a hint of kind of why these guys get into these roles. And what's the difference between the English coroner and the Irish coroner at this time? The English coroner is considered a magistrate of the people because they don't have this political strife, this politically divided society that's incredibly volatile, incredibly different. They're considered magistrates of the people. Well, not so much in Ireland. And I came across this, another, research find. This is at the British Library. I couldn't find it anywhere else. And it's the Irish Medical Dictionary of 1843. And I highlight it for a reason, because it's supposed to be just a directory of like all the MDs and, what their qualifications were. But it's the one that actually has the coroners listed. And it really wants to talk about what they're supposed to do. And it's an actual guide. Now, there were other guides. Jervis, John Jervis is more for the English coroners, and he wrote about it. And anybody researching coroners are like, oh, there's John Jervis, but it's not specific to Ireland. This is very specific to Ireland because it's the Irish Medical Directory. And it also shows a different sense of politics. Like maybe they're following Wakley a little bit with that medical background. Like maybe we'll embrace the coroners and maybe we're going to try to start measuring a little bit of who's got a medical background. But what I thought was kind of interesting with this is, it's like the fifth sentence into coroners, what coroners are supposed to do. And it says his office is for life, but he may be removed for misconduct. So it's a situation that's of great importance to the country, but it should never be allowed to fall into disrepute by being committed to the hands of dishonorable or ignorant persons. So what's happening here, there's a footnote that actually says that the Dublin coroner was conspiratorial with a surgeon. They were kind of pretending inquests were happening to get paid. This doesn't help the reputation of the coroner, by the way. And he is sentenced and sent to prison. And another coroner, who's the Sligo coroner, gets caught up for something similar and he's deported. So they're real worried about the Irish coroner in particular. It's very different in England and Ireland. And there's a lot of official documentation required. This is actually written by William Charles Waddell. It was put into the first famine casebook, and it's really just the formality of it, of that he really wanted to be a professional coroner and understand. He wasn't just like, kind of winging it. He was really formal in the way that he kept this casebook. He kept excellent notes, and this is actually quite a laid out format of he's going to ask Peter Gray to be a witness. And so he's got his format of that's the actual document that he sends each time to say, I expect you to attend this inquest on this person at this particular time. And he's also very good, William Waddell, at recording his expenses, because his expenses are out of pocket and he doesn't get paid until he puts them into the grand jury and they have to say, okay, we'll pay it. So he keeps excellent notes. And I bring the Poor Law Act into it. As much as the coroner is not included in the Poor Law Act, it's quite similar in that what we're talking about here is this is meant to be a form of social conditioning and actually telling the local elite you have to pay for the poor. You have to pay for these people, whether you like it or not. We've imposed this act. We're going to deal with Irish poverty, rural inequality. They established poor law districts and moral regulation and reformation. We're trying to infuse social stability into society. And the construction of workhouses, this is the oldest picture I know of, or only picture of the Clonus workhouse at Monaghan, is the construction of workhouses. We're going to home society's poorest, and kind of moving that into where you see the poor law districts are established. The same thing happens when they finally pass this act in July of 1846. There's coroners districts established all around the country. Everybody needs to be represented. Now, just because they put this act in doesn't mean it happened, by the way. It means someone went, we can't find anybody for that role. So just because they say it's going to happen doesn't necessarily mean it happened right overnight anyway. And what did you need? What were the qualifications for these guys? Property ownership. Not too worried if you have a law degree or a medical degree, right? As somebody I think shouted out at one of my talks, like jobs for the lads, this is kind of it. You had to reside locally. You couldn't live somewhere else. You had to kind of have some tacit knowledge of the region. And you had to be elected by people who were able to vote, of course. And all costs for inquests, again, just keep reminding that were paid by grand juries. So there's maybe a bit of nepotism. There's guys who want, you got to have somebody vouch for you if you want this job. And now we're in July of 1846. It doesn't actually get implemented till 47, but this shows the timing on this. I mean, one could look at it that, Robert Peel already, the famine has started. So the famine has started and you got Robert Peel, he's done what he can. He's secretly bought corn to try to have it shipped over to feed the poor. He's abolished the UK corn laws. He's established a relief commission, and he's also offering loans and grants to local grand juries in order to help them fund this. And what that does is it saves some people, but it doesn't save his job. So what we've got is this being implemented in July of 46, kind of around the time that everything's starting to, we don't know what's going to happen, but it's kind of about to not get much better. And I would like to think, even though I have documentation about it, that it isn't a coincidence that this act gets finally made. There were lots of bills before it, but this finally happens now. I think the timing's quite, maybe not so coincidental. And so were the coroners and inquests visible to the public? So like I said, this is new research for Irish history, this focus on it, but is this new to the people who lived then? And, here we got Lord John Russell. So we're in July of 46. Robert Peel is gone. And we have Lord John Russell, who is, he's trying to push through the Labor Aid Act, right? So he wants extensive public works to happen. And the Public Works Act, where he can now finally tell the local grand juries, you're going to pay for poor people. You're going to start taking out loans. You have to fund this. So the local elite are under more pressure than they've ever been. Only those who can prove destitution are going to secure employment. And he relies too much on Trevelyan, who of course has a belief in providentialism, that the poor are essentially to blame for their own situation in many instances, or blame for their own poverty. So what does this have to do with the coroner's inquest? Right. So I'm just setting the scene. This is all that's happening. And now we're kind of really going to get into it, which is what we have here is 2 letters. And I'm going to stick with July 46. Russell's just got in. And what we've got is Lambert is the head of the local relief committee in Ross in County Galway. And he's writing to the head of the relief commission. And what he's saying is, I regret to inform you that I've just heard a coroner's inquest has within the last few days returned a verdict of death by starvation for a few miles. This county is the poorest district perhaps in Ireland, and I regret to say it has been met with but little consideration and attention, but one small public works being granted in it. And so what he's reporting is the grand jury's not doing their job. There's not enough loans being taken. Now that but he's referencing that coroner's inquest. This is the official and authentic. This makes it real. So this isn't just I heard someone died of starvation. This is a coroner's inquest was taken on this. And so, kind of moving it through, we've got August 1846. Russell rushes the Labor Act through. He's trying to expand public works. He's trying to, this legislation is, we're going to just about to find out if it works or not. So we kind of go to the winter of 1846. And what we've got here is the death toll has increased as a result of these government policies. And what we have here is Grant, who's a local sub-constabulary man, who's also on the board of guardians in his local district in Sligo. And he's writing to the Constabulary Inspector General, Duncan McGregor, saying, we just had somebody who died of starvation just down the road, but it's been taken by a coroner's inquest. Can you look into it? So what does happen is McGregor then does reach out and say, did you know of this guy Brian Waters, who came to his death by absolute want of food? What happened to this guy? So this is being escalated up, but what they're doing is referencing coroner's inquest because they're official. And so kind of taking it through is, and I'm sure that anybody who's been interested in Irish history, and particularly the famine history, you see an awful lot reported from County Galway, from County Mayo and Galway. But a lot from, there was a coroner there named John Atkinson, and he used the media in a way that he wanted to expose what he saw there. So what John Atkinson's doing is telling the Mayo Constitution, look, I just had 8 inquests that I took of people starving just in the past week. There's people, and I'm conducting the inquest. And there's lots. And you can imagine, because, things are not great there. But there's one inquest in particular that's on the 16th of December of Catherine Walsh. She's able to work on the public works. She's an elderly woman. She's around 70. She's able to work on the public works until inclement weather sets in, bad weather sets in, and she's unable to withstand the cold and unable to work and couldn't earn enough money to buy food. Verdict of death was from the absolute want of the necessaries of life. So if you can't work and then you can't afford to buy any food, then you're going to starve to death. And it doesn't matter how old you are, there's no outdoor relief. So he's trying to draw attention to this. And there's also another letter that he writes to the Lord Lieutenant saying, can you please help us? There's not enough local support. The policies aren't working. And it's published in the newspaper. So it shows in this instance an agency between the Mayo Constitution and John Atkinson, the coroner, that they're publishing this. They're getting the word out there. And it's actually picked up around the country. So newspapers are powerful to publish inquests. And even more so is that there's an anonymous letter that's sent again, but to the nation in December. And it says, if there's these deaths by starvation in Connacht are not the only such inquests and verdicts by a great many that did not come to the knowledge of the editor, and that many take place in the country which never find their way into newspapers at all. If such a number of deaths by starvation are authenticated by coroner's inquests, then what must the multitude that are actually occurring be? So they know this is happening. Coroners only investigate sudden, suspicious, and violent death. If it's reported to them, then they make that decision. They're not under obligation to every starvation death. So they pick carefully, but each coroner might be a little bit different, as we're going to find out. And even Daniel O'Connell, he's a conciliation holdout same month. And he's stating flat out, to a large audience, and, it got lots of press, that if deaths from starvation are authenticated and certified by coroner's inquests, and yet people are not sufficiently aroused, like what's happening, and what he's really talking about are the local grand juries and merchants and people that don't want to pay for the poor. And, I won't go into now, but things don't change that much, right? So, and what do we have here? Well, this starts to change. What are the politics of the inquest? And this one's rather powerful, and it's, it's been around a while, but in the context of this talk, it's really poignant in that here's a jury, a Galway City jury, that now this is different. They're made up of more, kind of merchants, middle class, men that aren't really fearful of potentially any kind of fallback. And they go out of their way and they say that they find that the deceased, Mary Commons, who is an inmate at the Galway workhouse, died from the effects of starvation and destitution. But they very specifically name Lord John Russell and his administration for killing this woman. They know that this is the reason these things are happening. So the inquest is the voice of the people. So, like I said, in England, it's the magistrate, they see them as the magistrates, the people. Well, this really is an inquest. This is a voice of the people. There are people that really do want to say something, but maybe not every region in the country is the same. And then here's one, it's the register of death in the Catholic registers in Londonderry in April 47, that actually then again identifies Lord John Russell as the reason why people are starving to death. So the inquest is a very political and powerful way to record death, but you can see there's a lot of politics around this. And then this brings us to William Charles Waddell. So who is he? William Charles Waddell is a descendant of a Scottish ancestry, as planted Scottish ancestry, a guy named Alexander, they're all Alexanders, Alexander Woodall in 1698, who escapes and is given land in Monaghan, escaping religious persecution. So his family's been around a long time. And I'll show you a few slides of just like personal effects to kind of give a feeling of how long that family's been around. But he's not just the coroner. Before he's a coroner, before 1846, he becomes a coroner in 1846. He's a land agent. He's a merchant. He's a landowner. He does all the family land management, and they don't like him for it very much. He's a poor law guardian, and he serves on lots of local committees. But in 1846, in the Slater's city directories, he's considered local elite. So they embrace him. How does he get the job? Because he has all this, right? He's got that reputation. He's got the right social status. But he also runs unopposed. So you had to have an election to be the coroner, but nobody's going to run against him. It kind of stacks the deck that maybe nobody dared run against him because they had already picked him. He was going to be their guy. And just to give you some background about like his politics. So this is an example of he had a great uncle that ran a volunteer unit to try to, before policing was in, they had their own volunteer unit. It's a medal that's actually available at the Military Museum in Dublin. So they're owned the Independent Rangers. He's also, these are the many few of many wills in his family of land changing hands, and he seems to be always at the center of it. This is the home he lived in, Lisnavane House, which is right across the road from Clover Hill. So their family is status, and these are built around 1800. So this is a family of status. This is a family that, has large tracts of land. And also, they've been around a long time. This is from the Monaghan rent book in Monaghan town. It's 1831, but it goes back really far. Like Waddell's lands were there for a long time, long time, 100 years earlier, easy. And this is his father, who's a merchant in town. So they're really well known. So I'm just trying to give an idea of who he is. And his father actually was part of the Liberal Club in 1820. So you've got kind of different politics happening here. I know that there were some, his grandfather was in the United Irishmen, but then you have other people that might have been much more conservative. And what William Waddell tries to do is he wants to fit in, especially after 1798, the year he's born. But with the politics going, he just wants to fit in, and he's going to go very conservative, or, that's what he was into. You got to make your own mind up. But I think what happens is he takes this job as being the coroner quite, he's going to be a professional. And the inquest that he chooses, because he has to look into them, but it's up to him whether he looks into them that much or not. And I think the inquest of Pat McPhillips, so we're in March of 1847 now, and the crisis has really hit Monaghan. And it's just an example of one of the inquests that he took. And I've taken the liberty of not changing the facts, but rewriting it a little bit to kind of, scope it out a little bit with a little additional research about who these people were. So this all takes place in Gala, which is the townlands that we've got on Wednesday, 11th of March in 1847. Jane Forsyth opens the doors of her mud-walled cabin to Cecilia McPhillips, who arrived with her 4 children, all crying from hunger. Jane lit a fire and placed the pot over the hearth so Cecilia could make dinner, which consisted of the meal she had gathered by begging throughout the Monaghan countryside. The children were fed and soon fell asleep on the hard dirt floor, and early the next morning, while the meal for breakfast was being prepared, Cecilia's young son, Pat, was sitting by the fire, warming himself, when suddenly his head fell to one side. The women feared he was dying, and a bed of straw was made for the unresponsive boy, and his mother placed him in it. Pat lay there quietly for about an hour until he stopped breathing and died. So at 8 o'clock the next morning, among the headstones in the grass at Coleman's Church of Ireland's graveyard in County Monaghan, there's a woman spotted with a spade, and it's Pat's mother trying to bury him, and it's Benjamin Beattie, who's the schoolmaster. So the schoolmaster sees her in the graveyard and says, could you just please stop that? I want to go to the Archdeacon, Father Russell, and ask what we should do about this. So Father Russell's quite upset. He gives him money to buy her and her remaining children some breakfast and try to procure a coffin because she couldn't find one. And so that communication from the Archdeacon then would have gone to the constabulary, who informed William Charles Waddell. And here we are with an inquest going to be conducted on Pat. And what's telling is, what are they looking for? The medical testimony in this is incredibly important because, she's going to bury the body. There's it is unusual times, but it has some suspicion around it. And so what we find is that it's Dr. Christian who says that there's no mark of any external violence on this child, but one sore, one of the feet are sore and ulcerated, and considers that he died from exposure and want of nourishing food. Well, the sore is from walking around with his mother to try to look for food, and they have nowhere to go. And so why is this happening? Well, they're in Clontibret in County Monaghan. Not that I expect everyone to know this, but there's no outdoor relief. The Monaghan Poor Law Union, they'll offer, if you're lucky, you can get into the workhouse. But apart from that, they don't want to offer any outdoor relief. And as time goes on, the Monaghan Poor Law Union, as Cormac O'Grada did a measurement of all the workhouses in the country. And Monaghan Poor Law Union comes in number 1 at the least amount of debt after the famine. So they don't want to pay for anybody. So it's pretty reasonable to think if Cecilia McPhillips had an outdoor relief ticket or some kind of something that she could have gone for, that, maybe this wouldn't have been the circumstance. And so just to kind of, this is a different type of inquest entirely, but everybody I think thinks that, and I've heard this and read this and seen this, that Ireland was a very violent place during the famine. And I'm not saying that that isn't necessarily true. I can only go on the inquest that I have from my one guy, William Charles Waddell, of how many murders that he investigated. And I was only able to find in the famine years 6. There's 2 double homicides of 2 sets of women. I'm only going to go through one today because we don't have enough time. And the others are a man who was killed by his son fighting over money, and the other was unknown. But that's all. You can read between the lines and look for different things, but without any evidence, it's very difficult to kind of piece that together. So I'm not saying it wasn't violent. This is quite violent. So this should at least help identify the crises at a particular point in time. And this one is in April 1847, a few weeks after Pat McPhillips dies. I would pinpoint this as the height of the crisis in County Monaghan. because this is quite desperate. You've got two women who are elderly. They have been murdered in their own home in the townland of Mullacrockery here. And the Northern Standard, who, by the way, that's the Monaghan newspaper, Pat McPhillips didn't make it in the paper. He's not that important. In fact, only 5 starvation inquests ever made it into the Northern Standard, and 3 of those were only after the local elite had to start paying for all this. You know, maybe it was, geez, this is awful, look what's happening. Well, there wasn't too many before then. Now, the Cullen sisters, this does make it into the paper because, as I mentioned before, the work of the coroner is all about finding murders. You know, you want to find a culprit. But there's a few other reasons why this one makes it in the paper and why this is important. So the Northern Standard says, the barbarous murder of 2 very inoffensive and respected old women who supported themselves by a little huckster shop, aided by their neighbors, by whom they were generally esteemed, and also frequent contributions from Mr. Shirley, who is a landlord and not very well liked by many at the time, who was so much concerned on hearing of their murder that he offered a £200 reward for the discovery of the perpetrators of the horrid deed. And they survived on selling a few cakes and quantities of tobacco. So, you know, what happens, I mean, this right here this is what happened to Anne Cullen. So she's got 7 wounds to her head, of which 5 different places fractured the skull. So, I mean, if you now want to kind of apply a little bit of a, you know, modern sensibility, I mean, somebody has hit her 7 times in the head, 5 of which easily would have killed her. So when you apply a modern sensibility, there's a few things you can look into. Is this personal? You know, that's usually kind of the tome of modern forensics. So the Cullen sisters had been robbed and brutally beaten. One is stripped of all her clothes. The other one almost. And the blankets from the beds were missing, 2 brand new cloaks that they had bought, a new flannel petticoat or 2, and their shoes. And yet 17 shillings are found in a barrel. So all their personal possessions are gone, you know, important ones that keep you warm, I suppose, and, you know, but the 17 shillings are there. So why is, you know, the landlord Shirley doesn't have a very good reputation for lots of good reasons, which you don't have enough time to go into, but not a good reputation. He's supporting these women. He's an advocate for them, that he's going to offer a £200 reward. And then there's a man who's involved, is a witness who went to the house to find the bodies after it was reported to him. And it turns out James Lundy is his name. He's a middleman. And with a little more research, just a few weeks after the murders, he evicts a family, a Catholic family of, their name is Keenan, of 8 people, and evicts them, puts them out on the road. So you've got Shirley, who's evicts people and isn't super supportive and doesn't feature well in my book. James Lundy, who's also equally not, you know, maybe the best guy in the world, but they are really concerned about these women. And they're going to put out a reward, and they're very supportive. But there's one little fact in all this, in the inquest, that stands out, is that a woman named Mary Bell is the first one to find the bodies, and she goes the morning and finds them, and she was there to pay back the 6 pennies that she owed one of the Cullen sisters. So now this lends a whole different situation. They're money lenders, and money lenders, you know, there's lots of names for them. One of them's Gambines, and, you know, money lenders aren't really looked at favorably in history, and, you know, these 2 women are murdered. So you know, you can look at this a few different ways. I mean, I know that there's an oral history in Carrickmacross, which is the nearest town, that during the famine, that female money lenders, it did exist, charge as much as 100% interest. So maybe the Cullen sisters, you know, there might not be some people who are fans of them, but ultimately the double homicide really reflects that a murder of 2 elderly women who can't defend themselves, that are money lenders, but that the politics around them suggest that this has now hit a peak in the crisis in this section of County Monaghan in Barony and Forney. And so we're in April. This is still April of 47. Some coroners aren't holding inquests anymore. No, it's too expensive, they're told. And the grand juries are saying it's a bit too expensive. We don't need to look into all these people starving. We don't need to look into it. In fact, you don't have to worry about it anymore. Too expensive, and if the cause of death is obvious, we just say that's enough. But not everybody agrees with this. And so we have in the Athlone Sentinel that we've lost those unimpeachable evidences of the hideousness of our condition presented by the coroner's records of the coroner's inquest. So this is important. Everybody knows that the coroner's inquest is the official way in order to record death. I'm just going to read it if I can find it after Peter went to printing this out. Is presented the records of coroner's inquest and the verdicts of the coroner's juries. Why? Because grand jurors, moved by selfishness for their class more than by economy in regards to the people's money, have recommended that coroners should no longer hold inquests upon subjects believed to have died of starvation. No wonder they should not wish to have any such testimony of their misdoings. So it's right out there. People know that they might not want these investigations going on to find out what's happening. And then this is kind of the last part of my presentation, is that, so we're in 1848, and we're kind of in that last phase of the famine. Pardon me, we're in 1847. We're in a final phase of the famine where the quarter acre clause is, facilitating evictions, food deposits, depots are closed. There's no employment in public works. This is all petering out here, and there's no assisted emigration proposals. So people, the only place left to go is, this is the Monaghan Poorhouse, what's left of it, one of the buildings, and this is the jail. And so what we're going to see is people are going to start as a final rush because they can't get in necessarily. Institutions are it. And so just look at the jail quickly, which is that no task could be more discouraging. And this is from the two inspector generals of the jails, that could be more difficult than trying to detail the history of the prisons is in 1847. And why is that? So in Monaghan, of the inquest that William Waddell took, as you can see, you can't, but anyways, is December of 1847 and January 48 is the highest number of inquests. So he takes himself 11 inquests in those 2 months, but actually there was another 20 that aren't documented. Why? Not really. My strong suspicion is because there were simply too many. He had a multitude of other inquests, and he's just one guy. He served as the coroner on his own because the Monaghan Grand Jury didn't want to pay for another person until 1848. So he was the only coroner in the county for about 1.5 years. So there's a consistent theme here of not wanting to pay for things. And I throw this person out here into the mix is, even though everybody in the coroner's casebook, it never ends well. For Michael Dolly, he's not in the coroner's casebook, but he's an example of, kind of shows what the conditions are. Is that among Monaghan's jail prisoners awaiting transportation, there's this hugely colorful and notorious local character, Michael Dolly. He'd been sentenced to transportation in 1844 to Australia, to New South Wales. He had been stealing cattle, and he even stole an iron plow from William Charles Waddell. So, it's, Dolly is, they all know him. He is a very well-known character. He goes all the way to Australia, and he's not supposed to come back, but somehow he makes his way back to Monaghan, and he's hiding out, and they catch him, and he has to go to the Monaghan jail. So what does he do? He has a conspiracy in the Monaghan prison. He's compared with Dick Turpin, the English highwayman, and Jack Shepherd, and they capture the notorious Michael Dolly, and he wants to break out. But why? The conditions. I mean, there are 30-some people who die in a very short amount of time while he's a prisoner there, and it really shows that a healthy person there does not want to be there. That's the last place that they want to be. And there's lots of other inquests that explain who is there of those ones that William Waddell took. They're all old men with previous conditions. And by February 1848, the Monaghan jail has the 5th largest number of debtors in the prison. So this is the last chance saloon of anybody who can get any kind of shelter or food. They're trying to get themselves into jail. And then an example of what's happening elsewhere at the same time, because we're in February 1848. And this is a priest on the island of Inishbofin that he sees really healthy women. A lot of young women are dying of starvation. And what he says is there's no coroner inquest on these islands to record their starvation deaths. and essentially shame on the legislators, because that should be happening. So there's still a cry out for the coroner and the importance of the inquest. And we have an inquest here of Owen Traynor, which is just another example of poor legislation. The Gregory clause has come in, and there's no relief for anyone who owns any land over a quarter acre. Owen Traynor had healthy guy, he has 5 acres. He sells his land. He sells a little bit of land and makes some money to try to feed himself and his family. He sells a little bit more land. He goes to the poorhouse and says, I got to get in for me and my family. We can't afford it. And they say, no, you still have some land. So Owen Traynor ends up in the case book as someone who was a healthy man, who tried to get help. There was no outdoor relief, and he dies and can't support his family. And so finally, I mean, we're in August of 1848, and suddenly, which shouldn't come as a surprise, hopefully at this stage, is why would there be a call to get rid of the coroner's office entirely? What a surprise is the Sligo and Cork grand juries, as amongst many others, say, no, we don't need this. This costs too much money. Why don't we just have the magistrates do it? And the maths don't add up. It's actually ludicrous. They're trying to say it's 25 grand it costs the taxpayer, but it's really more about 8 grand. And then you have other different, it depends on the politics of the region. In Kings County, the coroner himself and the grand jury come forward and say, no, we actually think this is a really important role in society and we're going to keep doing it. And they and others like them keep that, perpetuate that. So they don't abolish the office of coroner. But what happens in County Monaghan? Well, they agree with the Sligo and Cork jury. We should abolish the coroner, even though William Charles Waddles, he's in their club. He's a member of that local elite. And it demonstrates that they resent the fact that they have to pay for poor people's deaths to be investigated. And they don't like the fact that it's exposing at a local level that they aren't doing enough. And there's not been enough loans taken and not enough relief. And they also don't want to pay William Charles Waddle and the new coroner the fees that their expenses they put in for. So just my final slide is the Coroner's Bill in 1851, is we have another radical MP, John Reynolds, who says that, there hasn't been a lot of inquests at the workhouse either, that it wasn't mandatory by law. So where's that body of evidence? And he says, well, there are no inquests held there because nobody want to, again, put the union to the expense. And it would have exposed all the malpractices that were going on. So kind of in conclusion is that the role of the coroner exposes corruption, mismanagement during the famine, exposes and really teases out the attitudes toward the poor at that time. And the fact that it survived through the 19th century to now is, quite significant. And that it's a really important role that does an awful lot of social good. And certainly William Charles Waddle's case books have lent there's an awful lot in them. Besides my book, I'm really proud of that my book was published, but I'm also working on the first volume with Professor Marie Coleman with the Irish Manuscripts Commission. It's an extremely detailed volume, a lot of extra research. It isn't just a transcription, as I found out. There's an awful lot more that can be added to it, and it'll be an amazing asset for other people to use for their research during the famine, I hope. So thank you very much.
Michelle, thank you so much. Are you happy to stay there?
Sure.
Take some questions?
Oh, sure.
So obviously we've got people in the room and we have an audience online through Teams as well. So if you're online and you want to ask a question, you can either type your question into the comments box or raise your hand, and Luke will allow you to speak at that point, right? Okay, great. So let's open it up. Who wants to start? Yeah.
Hi, Michelle. Congratulations on the work. As somebody from that part of the world myself, it's great to see that area being examined in such detail. Just are the original casebooks in Clonus Library?
So the famine casebooks at Clonus Library, I have that transcribed with lots of additional information. That's volume 1 for the IMC. That's in Clonus Library. The second is owned privately. And then the third book that says Hugh Swansea's Inquest, I think they've changed it by now, but that's at Clonus Library as well.
Okay. Thanks.
Sure.
Marie?
I was wondering, is there much contact between the coroners? So we've Man Mayo and we've Waddle in Martin. Is there any evidence that they got in touch with each other?
Yeah, there's a couple inquests. Hugh Swansea gets hired. There's no definitive date, by the way, but like at some point in 1848. So Waddle's the only coroner from about February 47 for like at least a year on his own at like the worst possible time. There's a couple like in post-famine years of him and Swansea. He went to, it's kind of, the coroners now have told me this, it's kind of like, it's like a territorial thing, like it's my body, because once you start the investigation, it's yours. And that Waddle showed up to 1 or 2 inquests because Swansea was in Dublin or in court because he was a solicitor, but that they would have communicated that Swansea's then going to take it over. But more extensively than that, I don't have anything.
Yeah, Constantine?
Yeah, thank you. Excellent. The book sounds very fascinating. Thank you very much. My question would be regarding murders, because you said during the famine there was relatively little in terms of murder. You've seen all of the case books. Is there anything that stands out in terms of well, murder in general, but especially murder for political motives, because that would be what I'm looking into in the area.
Yeah, there's some. I have some in this book. This was about the famine, but I do have several sectarian murders that happen afterwards, and they're in the Irish Coroner. They were usually pretty high profile, like they would have been made it into the newspaper. It's not like the hidden, starvation deaths. There's just not. They're in there. There's just not as many as you think. So like there's faction murders, like there's, somebody's found and it looks like a whole bunch of people ganged up and, beat him up, but there's not, you can only kind of go on the facts. So I think he was murdered. Yeah. But like, I don't have any more information about, or any kind of suspicion or any evidence really of what that could mean, but they're in there.
Sophie?
Thanks for that. That was fascinating. I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the inquest process itself. Like, are they just being detectives, or are they doing autopsies?
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. He finds out that somebody's died and they want them to investigate it, and then he'll go, and it kind of starts out as an inquiry. So you'll show up and say, tell me the circumstances, where's the body? And he'll say, yeah, I think this is a full inquest. And then he's got to get a jury together. So he has to formally ask the jury to be there. He has to ask the witnesses to be there. And even though there's a guidebook, I mean, it doesn't always go to plan. I mean, I think sometimes you can read between the lines that if you show up and the inquest is out in a field, you've probably asked some of the neighbors to be jurors in some cases, that some of the evidence is there as such. But like that, there's only 1 or 2 inquests. In fact, at the Cullen sisters, of one of the inspectors, the constabulary will go in and say, I looked for footprints. Other than that, you don't get a whole lot. But in the murder cases, you get a little bit more, not as much as you'd like, but there's some really good stuff in there.
Yeah, if you're starving at this time, are you better off being in the workhouse or going to prison? Is it going to prison means you're going to be going to Australia? Is that a better life than starving? And you mentioned about the crime rate going up. Is there kind of any kind of correlation between people committing crimes to get to prison, to get to Australia to?
Oh yeah. It's there was an inquest of this guy, of one man who tries to break windows to get the other man to say he has to go to jail because he wants to get in, and the man won't press charges and he dies. Like, he wants in, so he has shelter and food. And then locally, it's, well, who offers better food at that time? Is it the workhouse or is the jail? And actually it was the jail. So I mean, if you had your choice, I don't know. And then you kind of have to factor in how many, unhealthy, dying, diseased, and maybe mentally unsafe people are around. You've got the jail with a smaller population than the workhouse. I mean, I'd probably pick the jail.
So the crime rate does go up?
There's a lot of debtors.
Right.
So I can't say. I think crime increased for sure, but my research has been that there's a lot of debtors. So there's people who, right till the end, like on the Bath estate, for example, there's a land agent, Tristan Kennedy, and he sends out, I think, 691 writs or bills to try to say you got to pay or you're going to jail. Most everybody pays them. Only 7 don't. And this is around the same time, 47, 48. Most of them pay them and only 1 person goes to jail. But yet there's still people who are debtors who are in jail. And I believe there's like 89 in February 1848, there's 89 between men and women debtors in Monaghan jail. And that's the 5th largest number of debtors in County Monaghan. So I can't say it's that they're criminals. I'm saying that they're put in jail for debt.
Yeah, and they don't get transported, the debtors, right? They're stuck there.
They're stuck there.
Debts are,
Yeah, because they stopped transportation.
So is there a certain amount of crime to commit to get transported, and did that go up as well? If you got into prison and you think about, okay, if I commit another crime, I'm going to be deported, I'll get to Australia, get away from Ireland.
I think a really clever person might do that.
Yeah.
But they stopped transportation at one point, yeah.
yeah.
Maybe somewhat broader question, which is why I wait a bit, but with the evidence that you presented here regarding the, at least on the local level, systematically trying to cover up evidence for people's starvation or mismanagement by abolishing the coroner's office, I'm sure you're aware that there's quite a bit of a discrepancy between how the famine is viewed by academics, by historians, and publicly. Publicly, you would quite often hear it classified as a genocide, academically not so much. So there's obviously some sort of dialogue that we need to have here. How do you think your evidence that you found all this being systematically suppressed and so on would factor into that sort of debate?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very well aware of 2 schools of thought. I think one is that is kind of understanding it from a British history standpoint of what there's some things happening there of what the intention was. So if you pick the Poor Law, for example, in 1838, is why is that implemented? They're saying you have to pay for your poor. Now, a cynical person could say, well, yeah, they didn't want to pay for it. Well, that's true. But there's also, they started doing it in 1836. They have to do something about the poor. But I also think that, you know, it is certainly challenging looking at kind of that body of evidence that knowingly people weren't provided with the food and resource that they needed to survive. I just think it's to have that debate, you have to understand all the reasons why and then have that debate.
You want to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks for a really fascinating talk. Yeah, one of the most interesting points I reckon was how the actual role of the coroner wasn't actually requiring of any like medical expertise.
Yeah, that's right.
I was wondering, is it possible to like pinpoint the moment where that sort of professionalism was required?
Yeah, sure.
Well, after.
Well, it starts happening throughout. I couldn't pinpoint an exact time, but you start to see it. And I think maybe where I would first look is, I think it's in 1881, they start to, I think is when they say, it's 1881, when they say, okay, you do have to be a doctor, a lawyer, or a professional of some kind to be a coroner. And then I think you'll see that shift. And I think the other thing is that a coroner is a job for life. Like, unless, of course, you know, they commit fraud and get booted out of the country or arrested and thrown in jail, that they keep that job forever. So when those slots open, if you actually maybe had a look at what those coroners, you know, what's the demographic and the education and experience of the coroners after 1881, you know, you can find that. But that's would be my answers at that point in time.
We get any questions online?
Yeah, so there are 2 questions online. First one's from Patrick Duffy. So how do coroners' verdicts on homicides relate to murder trials and jury decisions? I remember reading coroners' reports from the 1830s stating the death was caused by a named individual. Did this influence any subsequent criminal trials?
Yes, it did. So there are records in the 1830s, and I know exactly what he's talking about. And it did name people. Now, the issue being is that it would result in a criminal trial, but it didn't necessarily mean anybody got convicted because, as I was saying, with Niamh Howland and Theo Hoppin's research and many others, and Earl Grey in 1833 saying that jurors were super intimidated and afraid to come, you know, and provide any testimony, you kind of have to look at the number of convictions would be lower than you would expect, even though the coroner's job was to try to name people. there's other factors, and it's a politically polarized society, and there's things at play here of why that conviction rate might not be as high as you'd expect.
And then Julie Mathias says, thank you for a great talk. If you have found any evidence of coroners selling bodies to anonymous after an inquest to help reduce the expense of the inquest?
No, I haven't. Not maybe. I mean, I know that the grave diggers, and that was like the medical students, wasn't it, in England? But I haven't found any of that here.
Yes.
Just ask a general question. Did the churches play any part in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, there's a trend of the Catholic priests in particular, the ones that are writing, particularly in 1846, when they're saying, like, we have people in our whole constituency, there's 10,000 people with no jobs, and we don't have nobody's taking out loans, and what are we going to do? But it's the Catholic priests who are quite vocal, and then even the Catholic priests Bofen Island or Innisbofen, he's saying, can we have the coroners here to record it? So they seem to be, and there's lots of other examples, but seem to be somewhat consistent in saying that they'd like a coroner there, that it's the official recording of death.
Did they carry any weight?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there are plenty of priests that provide different evidence. And one thing maybe kind of to that point is a trend that if anybody, like a local official, the predominant Protestant majority of officials and people in charge are Protestant, but the official representatives for Catholics would be primarily priests. So they would have weight in terms of what they said based on the politics of any given situation.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm just interested in about the selection procedure. It seems a bit contradictory. On the one hand, coroner can be elected by quite a wide franchise.
Yeah.
But once they're in for life.
Yeah.
There's no way accountable to people who elected them. What was the rationale for having those two extremes?
What's the rationale? Well, I suppose maybe how I try to answer that is that then it's that much more important about who gets selected and elected in. Right. So the fact that I'll use the evidence that I have is that I've got my guy, William Charles Waddle, who's runs unopposed. And then, yeah, he gets the job for life. So they're going to be very careful in who they select in that role. But for me to try to expand it, I'd be, making it up that I see any other correlations.
I suppose the idea is that the coroner is then politically independent.
Yeah, that's right.
Post, right.
Yes, that's
so
right.
Like, it's same as a judge, I suppose, for them. And judges are for life.
Judges aren't elected. It's the contradiction of allowing for a very big popular input into selecting the person, but then giving them complete autonomy once they're selected.
Yeah, it's a dangerous role in local government, so because they need to know. I mean, there's an example, actually, funny enough, about the sectarian murder. There's one later on, a guy named David Beard, is that Waddle looks into it, and the outcome isn't going to be what the local grand jury would like. They say that we're going to arrest this Thomas Hughes for the killing of David Beard. And in the newspaper, even though Waddle's like in with the local elite, it's like, well, he's playing a little game. They're like, somebody's playing a little game because it didn't go their way. So maybe to try to answer is that they're going to have they want somebody in there that they can muscle a little bit, or at least try to. And he doesn't seem, as much as he may agree with some of their politics, he sticks up for himself a bit here and there.
Constant.
You elaborate on that particular case a bit?
Yeah, I mean, you have it. There's a group of people coming into town that another faction don't like. So you have essentially early term to use, but Fenians and the Orangemen, and they have a fight, and a man gets killed and is the result. And so sort of the context of it is there's guns involved and the man's shot, and there's kind of like an old, I don't know if law isn't the word, but an old kind of positioning that you're allowed to defend yourself if you feel attacked with arms, and that would go, had been like a Protestant, instituted as a Protestant belief. So you're going to have some conflict there about who are you going to arrest for this murder. Are they allowed to shoot somebody because they feel attacked, or did they kind of go out and just kill the guy? Yeah.
Just quickly, you keep mentioning this coroner who was deported. Sligo. Where was he deported to?
I don't know, actually. I don't. I'm not sure exactly. But most people, you know, if they were deported, I would guess it was Australia. But it's definitely one worth looking into.
So he was transported, not deported.
It said deported, but you know.
Okay. So Michelle, I mean, there are hundreds of men across the 19th century who hold this post. But what else casebooks are unique as survivals as a complete set, and also the quality as well. So is it likely, you think, that out there in people's attics, you know, in the attics of gentry houses perhaps, there are other surviving sets of casebooks that have yet to come to light?
Yeah, I think there's every chance of that happening. The only other two that I'm aware of is there was, so first to answer your question, what makes Waddell's cases that I have found to date unique is that it names the person who died, where they were, the date that the inquest was held. Then it's the witness is identified with their name and the testimony is given. And it's not going to be that kind of testimony that is a quote, you know, this is exactly what she said. It's kind of a paraphrasing of it, but it does capture an awful lot of amazing detail about what people were eating, what their behaviors were, what kind of occupations and tasks they had on farms. I mean, there's some really cool stuff in there, like one's like the bog bailiff. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Or then you find that there's two guys that someone's approaching them and they're at a toll bridge that I didn't even know existed in County Monaghan. Or they used the rattle, you know, the old rattle, the town watch. There were still town watchmen in County Monaghan. So there's a lot of stuff you pick up that you can start to kind of build out about it. But I think that, you know, back to the other part of your question, so this is super unique in that way. I've not seen anything else that has this kind of like amazing detail. But then there's James Dillon from Kings County, that he also, there was a few records kept there. And I've seen some of them, and somebody's kind enough to send me a few, but it'll name the person, where the inquest was held, and the date, but it names like the jurors and then the verdicts. Now you could do a cool little study with the verdicts and you can compare some stuff to what I've done. I think it'd be great, you know, okay, fun, but I love it. Like, I think that could be really interesting. And then but it doesn't have this level of detail of those, like what they said and how they, you know, how they come across, and like how the whole story fits together to get the real story of what was captured at the inquest. That's not there. And then the only other one I've come across is in Tipperary. Somebody a while, maybe 10, 20 years ago did a year ago, some like stats on Tipperary coroner's inquests, but I haven't seen anything. There hasn't been any detail. So yeah, it'd be great to think that
there must be more out there.
There has to be. Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions online, Luke?
Yeah.
Any other questions from the room? Really interesting. It's a fascinating subject. It's a huge source, as you say, of not just information about the processes of dealing with death, but all this kind of inadvertent information about social history, about the kind of dynamics of how institutions work, about, you know, popular politics as well, but otherwise would be completely missing. It's a tremendously valuable source, and we're indebted to Michelle for having brought the material together and then having interpreted it so thoroughly in the book on the Irish coroner and Waddell. And we look forward very much to the edited version of the casebooks coming forward of the Irish Manuscripts Commission as well. They're going to be really important sources for a wide range of historical projects. So can you join me in thanking Michelle for coming and speaking? Good, thank you all very much. So we don't have a seminar next week, but in 2 weeks' time, we have Luca Crispy from University College Dublin, who will be coming to talk to us about James Joyce and his working practices. Not next week, 2 weeks.